Beckoning Grave. The chill autumn wind whipped Amy's scarf as she made her way down the familiar path through Greenridge Cemetery. Dried leaves crunched underfoot, the bare trees overhead forming a latticed canopy against the steel grey sky. She clutched the small bouquet of roses tighter as she neared the familiar rise on the east side of the cemetery. Her gut twisted into a knot like it did every year on this day, the anniversary of her husband Michael's death 10 years ago. She had made this pilgrimage without fail, struggling against the pull of grief that still crested in waves even after a decade. As Amy crested the hill, the rows of weathered headstones came into view. Her eyes instantly found the polished marble marker for Michael Archer, that achingly blank slab marking the end of a life of contained multitudes. Her chest tightened as she drew near, bracing herself for the hollow ache that never fully went away. Kneeling down, she brushed away the few stray leaves that had fallen across the headstone. The carved letters were still crisp and black, the arched angel visage staring sightlessly ahead. Amy laid the rose bouquet down and traced Michael's name with a trembling finger. That's when her breath caught in her throat, because just below his name, clear as day, was another etched into the marble. Amy Archer, her own name, carved with the same brutal finality. The dates were mercifully left blank, but it was her name inexplicably emblazoned on her dead husband's headstone, almost like a strangled addendum telling her to join him. Amy recoiled, her heart pounding as she scanned the marker in disbelief. Had it been a cruel prank? Some sick vandalism? She ran her fingers over the etched letters, the grooves razor-sharp and precise. Not recently carved graffiti, but part of the original stone. Fighting a wave of dizziness, Amy scrambled to her feet and looked wildly around the cemetery. A thick bank of fog was rolling in, muffling everything in a dreamlike hush. Her breaths came in panicked clouds as she clutched the marble headstone like a lifeline, searching for any other anomaly, some rational explanation. That's when she noticed it. Small cracks emanating like fractured veins from the corner where her name had been carved into the stone. She traced them with a fingertip, her own name splintering the marble with its mere addition. A sound made her jump, a hollow subterranean thump, like the roots of the ancient trees shuddering in the frozen earth. Amy turned towards the noise, following it several rows over to another cracked headstone, the name Samantha Carver inscribed on its face. With trembling fingers, she swept away the dead leaves from the base of the marker and gasped. The ground had collapsed inward, a narrow pit mouth yawning open like a grave wound. Amy stepped back, shaking her head in denial as a second thump arose from the depths, deep and booming, as if that small crater was exhaling a putrid breath from the underworld. A dark liquid began welling up through the crevice, thick and viscous. Amy clapped a hand over her mouth to stifle a scream as a slipper-clad foot punched through the ooze, thrashing as if caught in a tar pit. Another thump, and a pallid arm shot out, groping blindly for purchase. Amy stumbled backwards in horror as something emerged inch by agonizing inch, a naked, slick, eyeless creature hauling itself free of the subterranean darkness. Its mouth was pulled back in a permanent gasping rictus, skin veiny and blue like a premature birth. It collapsed to the ground, writhing and gurgling like a beached fish. It blindly grabbed the air, propelling itself by contracted lurches across the churned earth with a necklace of muck trailing behind. Amy retreated further as the creature dragged itself towards her with grotesque, visceral strength, leaving a furrowed trail of grave muck in its wake. Amy spun and ran, sobbing in gulping breaths as the fog enveloped her. Behind her, the thing was shrieking like a wounded animal, its piercing cry echoing through the boneyard. She sprinted past row upon row of headstones, the thudding of her pulse competing with the crunch of decaying leaves and the creature's frenzied howls in a waking nightmare symphony. She risked a glance over her shoulder and saw it. The pale, worm-naked thing was only a few rows back, locked in pursuit with impossible speed, like a deranged inchworm. Amy spotted the weathered iron gates leading out of the cemetery and willed her legs to move faster, even as her lungs burned. With a desperate burst of adrenaline, Amy slammed through the gate and into the quiet street beyond. She whirled around, hands shaking, expecting to see the thing emerging from the fog-shrouded graves. But only the drifting mist caressed the gnarled trees within, the Gothic headstones standing silent vigil for those resting beneath. Her shoulders heaved and shook as her mind struggled to process what she had seen, to force it back into the realm of nightmare and imagination. Heart racing, Amy broke into a stumbling run down the empty suburban street, desperate to put as much distance between herself and those terrible gates as possible. She chanced one last glance over her shoulder at the swirling grey miasma that had swallowed Greenridge Cemetery whole. She never saw the pothole in front of her. One foot plunged into its darkness, sending a shockwave of pain up her leg as bone crunched. Amy crashed to the pavement with a scream of agony, tasting blood as her mouth filled from a bitten tongue. Gasping, she tried to crawl forward, but her right leg flared in searing torture at the slightest movement. Through a sheen of tears, she looked back at the now distant iron gates and felt a stab of paralyzing dread. There, emerging from the mist in a series of herky-jerky motions, was the naked, pale thing slithering in pursuit. Its wheezing, rasping cries cut through the eerie silence of the fog-muffled street. Amy dragged herself with one arm across the cold asphalt, a trail of scarlet in her wake. Up ahead, a wooden door stood ajar in the side of a derelict building, yawning open like the keys to a sanctuary. She steeled herself and pulled again, willing herself across that yawning distance with a desperation that drowned out the fire in her leg. With its snapping skeletal fingers now almost within reach, the thing unleashed a shrill scream of ecstasy as Amy flung herself across the threshold and kicked the door shut behind her. She threw the bolt across just as that twisted face came into view through the wire-reinforced window, howling in animalistic frustration at having its quarry snatched away. Amy fought to catch her breath and get her bearings as she dragged herself across the filthy floor. The rank smell of mould and disuse hung thick in the air. Metal shelves lined the walls of what appeared to be an abandoned storage room or janitor's closet, in some relic of a building untouched by time or progress. Through a streaked pane of glass, she could see the fog-shrouded gates of Greenridge Cemetery across the street, like the mouth of a tomb. After several endless minutes, the emaciated ghoul finally retreated back into the outstretched claws of the mist. Amy sobbed in relief, cradling her shattered leg. She had escaped by the barest margin. After several endless minutes, the emaciated ghoul finally retreated back into the outstretched claws of the mist. Amy sobbed in relief, cradling her shattered leg. She had escaped by the barest margin. An ominous scraping sound pierced the quiet, like bone-gouging stone. "Oh, God, no." Amy turned just in time to see a skeletal arm punch through the drywall behind her, showering her with debris. She flailed backwards in horror as another corpse hand joined the first, the two of them pouring apart the plaster in greedy swipes. She screamed again at the sunken eye sockets that appeared next, empty pits brimming with primal hunger. Amy tried to scramble away, but her broken leg flared white-hot in protest. The wall bulged outward as more hands and clawing limbs joined the fray, madly tunnelling their way inward. Veins of cracks spread across the brittle surface like the fingers of the damned frantic to get at her. Finally, with a cascade of rubble and bone dust, the wall gave way completely. Amy pressed herself into the corner, sobbing in revulsion at the skeletal figures that unfolded themselves from the aperture and regarded her with empty sockets devoid of mercy or humanity. They were like living jigsaw puzzles made of bone, various skulls and rib cages interlocked together in a mass of knitted ossain. Spines arched and contracted as they pulled themselves through the breach, femurs and tibias entwining into makeshift limbs. Loose teeth clattered to the floor as their gruesome amalgamations lurched towards her, fleshless hands grasping the air with phalanx fingers. Amy screamed until her throat was raw, trying in vain to retreat as the closest skeleton loomed over her. Its jaw unhinged in a silent shriek, yellowed teeth like jagged tomb decorations. She kicked out with her good leg as those bony claws reached for her, sending the skull clattering away in a clatter of bones. The others pressed forward undeterred, remoulding and reconstituting as they came. Amy snatched up a metal rod from the ground and swung it in desperation, shattering bone and separating skulls from spinal columns in showers of chalky debris. But they just kept coming, rebuilding their skeletal forms with relentless hunger. One set of fused ribs grabbed her ankle in a vice grip, and Amy cried out as she felt her flesh dimple under that crushing force. She lashed out wildly, smashing its fingers until the bones crumbled, then scrambled madly to pull herself towards a grimy window on the far side of the room. With trembling hands, she tried prying it open as the skeletons pursued, their footfalls sounding like dice being shaken in a cup. Just as bony hands snatched at her shoulders, Amy found a rusted latch and shoved the window open with a scream. She tumbled out into a trash-strewn back alley, her broken legs searing in agony as she hit the pavement hard. Groaning, Amy tried dragging herself forward, but two skeletal creatures emerged through the window frame, silhouetted against the grime and fog like horrific gargoyles. They alit with boneless grace before converging on her. Amy flailed helplessly as they pinned her arms and legs, sinewy masses of compressed ossein holding her immobile, as a third figure climbed through the rusted window. This one had no true discernible form, instead an ever-shifting cyclone of skulls and rib cages clicking and rotating around a roiling vortex at its centre. It billowed towards her, the vile charnel clouds preceding it, clogging the alley with the reek of the grave. Frozen in terror, Amy watched helplessly as a lipless mouth composed itself amid the spinning maelstrom of bone shards. It opened wide, displaying a hollow gullet that seemed to plunge into endless black depths. An alien whine built within that Stygian maw, rising in pitch until Amy's bones vibrated in anguish. Her scream was swallowed whole by that awful keening as the cyclone surged forward. She felt an icy plume of necrotic air claw down her throat and seize her very soul. Like a vaporous riptide it pulled at her, draining her of warmth, of life, of all essence. Her flailing became more feeble as it drank her waning consciousness, that banshee shriek eclipsing all else. The last thing Amy saw were those empty orbits staring into her as the fog of extinction rolled in, erasing her frantic final thoughts and replacing them with a silence as vast and fathomless as the cosmos. She spiraled down into that yawning aperture, her being extinguished by its infinite void. Only the bones remained, another set of bare, osseous pieces to be reconstituted and resurrected into new members of that ever-growing, hungering legion. When the roving fog finally lifted over Greenridge and the surrounding area several days later, authorities were baffled to find every single grave in the cemetery lying open and plundered. Here and there were piles of decomposing gore, as if something had torn apart and feasted on the interred bodies. But the most disturbing discoveries were the seemingly random bones found strewn amidst smears of old decay, gnawed femurs in alleys, rib cages rattling in ventilation shafts, skulls split open behind dumpsters like obscene jack-o'-lanterns. All remained devoid of any DNA evidence or explanation as to how they arrived at such disparate locations or what unholy means had brought them back to grisly half-life. As the cemetery grounds were exhumed completely and laid barren, a final shock greeted the investigators. There, carved into the loamy soil that had once been Amy Archer's grave, were 4 jagged words, that seemed to have been etched by innumerable talons. The dead feast upon her.